at an excessive rate of speed of 60 miles an hour. I pulled his car over and asked him to produce his driver's license, and he had none. I immediately arrested him and searched him, and on his person I found a bag of white powder that has since been analyzed by the crime laboratory.
Mr. Stubbins, you hear what your lawyer just said?
Yes, I did.
And do you still know that on this plea of guilt, the court is going to send you from 3 to 7 years in the state penitentiary?
Yes, sir. I do.
It is so ordered.
Another youth sent to prison on a drug charge. 3 to 7 years out of his life for illegal possession of a narcotic. The price to society and the taxpayers, thousands of dollars a year to keep him in prison. But despite strict and often punitive drug laws, the use of drugs in recent years has spread swiftly, almost like a tidal wave, to all parts of the country. Teenagers, and by young people scarcely out of grade school. By people from all classes, crossing all social lines, in cities, middle-class suburbia, and small towns nearly everywhere.
It seems as though the college kids, the middle-class kids in this country, suddenly discovered marijuana in the mid-'60s, the early '60s. And up until that time, marijuana was used almost exclusively by Negroes, Puerto Ricans, and jazz musicians. And, you know, who gave a damn about them? So that we could have all kinds of repressive laws and nobody would bother with these people or even look at the laws. But all at once, Mrs. Murphy's kid from the suburbs, who was attending a prominent university, gets busted for marijuana. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've had medical students, law students, kids going to scientific institutions on national science grants. I've had all kinds of people who have been arrested for marijuana violations. And when this happens, suddenly our society starts to become aware of a problem, so-called.
The hippies, perhaps more than any other social phenomenon, have epitomized the drug issue. Nearly everyone in the hippie community has smoked marijuana. Call it what you will, pot, grass, hemp, or Mary Jane. It is the common denominator of the shared drug experience. Straight society has also discovered marijuana. As many as 10 to 20 million Americans have tried marijuana. Not everyone, however, goes along with the drug experiment. But there are those who may try LSD or heroin, or liquefy their kicks in a hot spoon. A fast jolt of speed, one of the amphetamines, is good for a 6-hour surge of euphoria, but then psychological dependence often follows, from which withdrawal can be a serious problem. Why does a person turn on with drugs? It's a highly complex question with no one answer. For some, it's the search for new thrills. For others, to be one of the crowd, or a flamboyant gesture of defiance toward society. And then there are those, particularly in the ghetto, who have been beaten to their knees by the sheer pressure of poverty. A drug like heroin can represent a last desperate bid for freedom. The use of drugs began to increase considerably among the echoing streets of such areas as New York's teeming Harlem following World War II.
When I first came to East Harlem in 1948, it was primarily a large Italian and Puerto Rican community. For our part, as far as the kids or the adolescents were concerned, it was constant warfare. There were many, many gangs. And the ironic thing is that the only thing that united Italians and Puerto Ricans together was the use of drugs.
After getting married, sort of couldn't meet up with the responsibilities that I had taken on, and sort of felt the need to escape from these. My first marriage, I've been married twice, has only lasted about 4 years, with continuously using drugs. I had 2 children. Right after my first marriage broke up, I was immediately married again. In fact, my first marriage broke up through meeting this other woman. I went along for about 8 months not using drugs, and finally I come back to getting the feelings of, you know, trying to escape again. And I started using drugs 8 months after my second marriage.
I feel that the main problem in the city at the time is environment. I would say that the good majority of the people that go on to heroin go on it as a result of their environment. The people they know, their friends, the ready availability to obtain it, and so forth.
I started to use it. I started to sniff it just to be part of the group. I started to use it while I was in school. And one day I woke up and I was addicted. You know, I woke up and I was very sick, and I didn't know what was bringing it about. But I did find out that as soon as I took some heroin through my nose, I got well. I felt normal.
And once a fellow is on heroin, it may be years before he realizes or wants to admit to himself that he is indeed a junkie and that he is in need of help.
A fellow can start on narcotics, I would say, at any age, really, of course, and within a matter of 3 to 6 months, starting out at about $4 or $6 a day, he can work his way up to a $100 a day habit.
I was using about over $100 a day. Everything I would get was to go through my arms.
Ultimately, of course, most drug addicts end up in prisons or hospitals, pathetic fragments of their former selves, or in overcrowded psychiatric wards, sometimes the result of an experiment with LSD, acid, or with one of the amphetamines.
Most of the people I know are not speed freaks. They're meth heads. Now, you can make an A-head by giving a guy too much. And I almost come close to being an A-head. A-head, when I was young, years ago, we had a set down here at Tetanus. I think I'm about the only one that's got any sanity left.
I know that a lot of people think that junkies, addicts, wander around the world dressed as hippies with beads and flowers in their hair. But it isn't true of all of them. Peter was very much a boy who liked to wear nice clothes, was always clean.
There are helpless other victims of the drug experience, those close to the youth who outwardly conforms, but who conducts the pilgrimage secretly, and by his very secrecy avoids detection until it is too late.
He was always dependable about being home on time at night, 11, 11:30, which wasn't late. But during all this period, we later found he was on drugs. And shortly after his 20th birthday, he died of an overdose of heroin.
And sometimes battle lines have formed behind a well-to-do suburban facade between parent and child.
I tried methadone, which I liked, which I became very addicted to. And then from there, the actual suicide attempts have been in the last 6 or 7 months, the real ones. All the attention I got, I was sent to a psychiatrist who taught me how to play chess at age 9. I wouldn't talk to him. So then my parents got quite upset because of the money they were spending. So then I tried again. They took me away from the psychiatrist for a while and changed schools on me. And then from there, several more attempts like swallowing aspirin, cutting my wrist, which doesn't work because blood coagulates and so forth. I called my parents and I was addicted to amphetamine bisulfate crystal, which is that you shoot and it's crystal, you know what that is. And I called them and I said I was addicted. I wanted to come home. I'd do anything. I conform to your standards or your rules, so forth, go to LSUNO, you know, be the perfect model of everything. And they said, no, you'd upset the family, and sent me off to Oregon. And I withdrew 5 days, cold turkey, on a Greyhound bus going to Oregon.
Methadone, LSD, heroin, their use is alarming, but marijuana is the great leveler. It's used universally within the hippie cults. It's part of the movable drug scene, international in scope and worldwide in acceptance. Britain, a tradition of centuries of empire and revolution. And more recently, the birthplace of the hippie, and with him, a whole new drug culture. Drugs became popular among the British youth and the world's youth after different pop groups began taking drugs. Flow of young people on the move. London, Paris, Rome, Istanbul, all have their youth in protest, their dropouts and drifters. There are also the curious young seekers of knowledge and adventurers in search of new experiences. No one label can be pinned on all. In Rome, they gather at the Spanish Steps. In Istanbul, there is another youth capistrano, Jenners, which among other things is an international clearinghouse of information about drugs. These gathering places are a United Nations in miniature. Young travelers come from Melbourne, London, Stockholm, and in ever-increasing numbers from New York, Indiana, Oregon. They pass in an endless procession through the Holy Land. They huddle for comfort in the caves on the island of Crete. Why do they wander? For some, undoubtedly, it's the adventure of youth. A chance for a once-in-a-lifetime odyssey and to sample the fires of spring. For many, it follows in the footsteps of a grand tour on which many a youthful scion of the 19th century was sent abroad to broaden his mind. Today, it may demand a pilgrimage to the mystic repositories of age-old wisdom. These intellectual and spiritual objectives, or what may pass for them, become readily apparent when you're in the Himalayas at 4,500 feet, particularly when the company is good and the roach pipes are lit. For some, unfortunately, the searching is often aimless, a thinly disguised excuse to cop out, to escape responsibility. They remain as lost as when they began. An experiment with the drug culture abroad can also turn into a nightmare, a sudden, harsh confrontation with strictly enforced laws. Literally hundreds of Americans are incarcerated in foreign prisons today for using, selling, or merely being in possession of a few grams of marijuana. That can mean an automatic minimum sentence of up to 6 years with no parole in a prison that has improved little since medieval days. In the United States, too, the use of marijuana can also bring eventual confrontation with the law. In some states, its mere possession has brought on a minimum sentence of 2 years, while selling has carried a maximum sentence of 40. The federal law was liberalized in 1970, and there's a trend toward modification of present state laws. But thousands of youth have been arrested and sent to prison for years because a pocket contained a few crude marijuana cigarettes. Youth has its complaints, too.
They've been known to plant things on you, like if you're in a place like, say, the Seven Seas, they'll plant something in your pocket if they want you. And they don't even have to find something. They could find an empty matchbox, and by the time it gets to the lab, it's full of grass.
The scene is New Orleans, but the complaint remains the same. Why do the adults put us down? They protect their own thing. Drugs like coffee, cigarettes, and synthetic crutches that range from sleeping pills and tranquilizers to Benzedrine. And most of all, liquor. many a young person is quick to cry hypocrisy.
Nationally, really, the marijuana laws nationally are, it's just a thing by the alcohol companies to keep their thing going because, I mean, who'd drink if they had grass, man?
Federal law has made possession of marijuana a misdemeanor in the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. Formerly, it was a felony, which of course is far more serious. The penalties remain heavy. Possession can bring up to a year in prison, or a $5,000 fine, or both. A second or additional offense is punishable with up to 3 years behind bars, and a maximum fine of $10,000, or both. The law in many states remains as strict as ever. Mere possession of marijuana is a felony. It confronts the offender with the same severe, inflexible penalty handed out for possession of a hard drug such as heroin. That can mean a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 years and as much as 40 years. And the sale of a thin single deck of heroin to a minor can in one state mean the death penalty. But despite stiffer laws and tougher law enforcement, the sale and use of illegal drugs has sharply increased throughout the country, particularly in the past decade. There are now an estimated 100,000 heroin addicts in New York City. The actual number throughout the United States may exceed 200,000. It's become obvious to many observers that stiff laws and harsh punishment cannot by themselves stem the increasing tide of drug use. Cries have been raised for better controls over the mass flow of illicit drugs into the United States, much of which passes through New York's teeming waterfront. A former federal narcotics commissioner has said, the mass flow of hard drugs into the United States could not be stopped even by the collective enforcement of the customs inspectors, all the Treasury agents, the FBI, and the combined strength of all our nation's armed forces. As much as 3 tons of pure heroin is smuggled into the United States every 12 months. It's considered a good year if a few hundred pounds is intercepted. The source of it all is the opium poppy. It has for centuries provided the secretion for miraculous painkillers and also for one of the world's most demoralizing vices. It is scientifically known as Papaver somniferum, grown in virtually every tropical country of the world. Its milky fluid was squeezed out for human enjoyment as far back as 4000 BC on the shores of the Mediterranean. Arab and Persian traders later introduced the mystic wonders of the poppy to other lands. By the 16th century, India was cultivating it. In the 17th century, the Chinese discovered the delights of smoking it. Millions of Chinese were thrust into moral and physical degradation. Then in the 19th century, a German refinement, a relatively simple chemical process transformed raw opium into morphine base, which has been for medical doctors and their patients a boon then and now. Later, another German refinement. From morphine base came the derivative heroin. The poppy's impact now could be funneled straight into the central nervous system, and the world's prisons and hospitals would be crowded with patients who experimented with this man-made derivative of the poppy. Its astronomical profits have made heroin the world's #1 illicit commodity. A deck of heroin sold on a metropolitan sidewalk is the final transaction in a long series of closely guarded clandestine operations. Turkey remains the principal source of the raw material opium. The opium is processed into morphine base, sometimes in Turkey, other times in Syria or in Beirut, Lebanon. French smugglers control the Lebanese market. They've been associated with all sorts of illicit international rackets for many years. The Lebanese sell the morphine base to the smugglers. The smugglers, predominantly French Corsicans, who have been in the traffic for many years, arrange for the illicit importation of the morphine base into France. Marseille is the capital of the Corsican underworld for all of France. Chemists in Marseille convert morphine base into heroin, the most difficult step in the entire chain of operations. Skilled chemists are not easy to find. A Turkish farmer sells 10 kilos of raw opium, about 22 pounds, for $350 on the black market. Through conversion, it is reduced to 1 kilo of heroin, now worth $3,500. Secret arrangements are made to smuggle the heroin to its markets, such as the United States, one of the most highly profitable of all. Smuggling is an art, and the Corsicans are among the world's finest practitioners. The automobile is one of their favorite carriers. There's hardly a part in it that has not contained a prize shipment of heroin. Besides such popular eastern ports, such as New York, there are thousands of miles of sparsely inhabited border, with Mexico the second major entry source of illicit drugs into the United States. Through this one port of entry alone, San Isidro, 6.5 million vehicles enter the United States each year. It's obviously impossible to search everyone thoroughly. Nonetheless, quite a few shipments of drugs are confiscated.
We are in our vault in which all the marijuana and heroin which is seized is stored until the criminal case against the defendants is terminated by federal court action.
Drugs are smuggled in here by boat and plane too.
Some 5,000 private yachts based in this area, all of which have the facility or capability of going to Mexican waters. This poses quite a threat, as do the increasing number of private aircraft crossing the international boundaries.
Once in America, heroin is blended with milk sugar and is cut at least one more time by the peddler himself. Its strength is now only 5%, normal for the retail market. Each packet or deck will sell for about $5. Thus, the original 22 pounds of raw opium sold by a Turkish farmer for $350 is ultimately worth on the sidewalks of Manhattan over $410,000, and in a panic, $500,000. The battle against drugs goes on. The key words today are research, treatment, and rehabilitation. Deep in the heart of Kentucky's bluegrass country, research goes on in the federal government's Addiction Research Center at Lexington, perhaps the foremost name associated with the study of drug addicts. Highly sophisticated equipment is shedding new light on how drugs attack both the mind and the body, and thus point to new ways for man to fight back. Through experiments such as these, scientists at Lexington have unmasked the addictive nature of specific drugs. Among things, they have also made pioneering discoveries about what is probably the most widely used of all drugs in the United States today, alcohol. New treatment programs have been launched both in and out of government. Here is the methadone approach, still experimental and not without its critics. Methadone, a synthetic narcotic, is administered as a substitute for heroin. It eliminates the craving for heroin as well as eliminating its euphoric effects. Dr. Vincent Dole of New York's...
So that we estimate, I think, that every patient that we treat saves the community $40,000 a year in not stolen, in neighborhoods that are not spoiled, in families that are not abandoned.
Another chemical approach is cyclazazine, a narcotic antagonist that blocks the effects of heroin on the central nervous system. There are other approaches too, such as person-to-person therapy based on the self-help idea. Perhaps the best known is that of Synanon, a private residential therapy group founded and managed by ex-addicts in California. It has grown rapidly and has its offshoots in many parts of the country.
A residential therapeutic community, if I may explain it for a moment, is a 24-hour-a-day living, working situation in which people go through all kinds of emotional changes. Drug addiction, of course, is not a physical problem, it's an emotional problem, and that's what we approach.
There are also such other noted self-help centers as Daytop Village, Span, and Exodus House, which may be located in the heart of a big city slum, where the action is. In such living therapeutic environments, the addict first goes off drugs and then is launched on the long, humbling road to an honest personal recuperation. He's gradually guided back to a useful place in the world. This is often done with the help and guidance of other addicts and ex-addicts. The entire story of drugs is vastly complex. Its wide-ranging ramifications cut across all boundaries of medicine and law, and moral and social attitudes. Whatever the drug is, tranquilizer or stimulant, sleeping pill, powder, or injectable liquid, stiffer laws and harsher penalties by themselves have clearly not stemmed the flood tide of drug use and abuse, and the growing numbers of human tragedies left in its wake. Essentially, the problem must be attacked in two ways. The first is an attack at the user's end. Continued research and public enlightenment will increase our understanding of drug users and how to treat them, as well as providing ways to intercept potential addicts before they're addicted. Secondly, we must directly attack the illegal source, whether it is a man-made chemical derivative, or Indian hemp, a coca leaf, or a poppy growing on the land. Studies sponsored by the United Nations show that in each country there is a practical and profitable alternative to the drug highway. In Baalbek, Lebanon, where 90% of the land was once planted with cannabis, marijuana, commercial crops are now grown which benefit mankind. And among other things, the French government has agreed to help combat the international traffic in heroin, much of which is refined in illicit French laboratories. Our knowledge about drugs has increased greatly in recent years, but more enlightenment is clearly needed by many people. Those of us who try the drug experiment must realize that we cannot create a better society by freaking out. And those of us who are of a square society, perhaps, must reach out and help with compassion and a real desire to understand not only others, but ourselves as well. What we as adults have to do is to invite the youngsters to join our adult world and make it a better place.
Thank you.